everybody, is in the infinite game. They approach issues from the standpoint of values and principles and affecting real change and making a difference in people's lives.
What a blessing to be back again with all of these magnificent freedom fighters. Yeah, this is a gathering, but this is not any gathering. This is the Sanders Institute. Martin Luther King Jr. and Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Baker. You have Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel and Dorothy Day. And the Edward Zaids and others, all of them trying to keep a focus on poor and working people in the midst of the American empire, in the midst of the American democratic experiment. Then here comes a brother from Brooklyn, mediated in Vermont, who becomes the great political figure in the context of such truncated electoral politics in this nation, that raises the banner of working people and says, Wall Street, you're too greedy. What about working people and poor people? Neoliberal capitalism, you got greed running amok. We are here because there's too many folks suffering. And when our dear brother Bernie Sanders stepped forward, and I heard his voice, and I looked in his eyes, I saw the window of his soul, I said, he's for real. He's not one of those simulacra and semblances who want to use the language but not want to bear the burden and engage in the service to working people. Vicious despotism of the elites in Saudi Arabia, it was his love for the people in Yemen. Because we don't like to keep the focus on the folk when they're down and out. Sometimes you have to have a death of a brother who's a journalist. We love Jamel, but the death of a journalist all of a sudden becomes a catalyst. Folk in Yemen been catching hell for years. He raised the bill before. We're here to come together in such a way that the moral and spiritual dimension of who we are as human beings can spill over into politics to make this world, this nation, a better place in the face of all the ecological and the economic and the moral and the spiritual and various other kinds of catastrophe with which we must come to terms. So I am blessed tonight to introduce to you one of those who, when the history is written of those who raise their voices for poor and working people, Bernie Sanders will be one of those voices. My dear brother Bernie, come and share your voice.
How would you like to run for president and have this guy introduce you all over the country? Change always comes from the bottom, not from the top. And all of you know, and what this institute is exactly about, is to try to educate, go beyond the corporate media to talk about the real issues facing real people. We're going to win that resolution that says the United States has got to end its relationship with the Saudi despotic regime there and get out of Yemen. We should be rethinking our relationships with governments like Saudi Arabia. Poverty. Got 40 million people, including more than a few in this beautiful state, who are struggling every single day to keep their heads above water. Every day, the editorial pages would say these are extreme, these are radical. The American people don't want it. It turns out that that is exactly what the American people wanted. Not shockingly, it turns out that the American people believe that if you work 40 hours a week in America, you should not be living in poverty. And I want you all to think, and this is where I am hopeful, is that just a few years ago, when we talked about $15 an hour as a minimum wage, we were thought to be extremists and fringe people. All right? But in 3 years, a lot has happened. We have cities and towns all over, and states all over this country passing $15 an hour minimum wage. We forced Amazon and Disney to go to $15 an hour. And I am absolutely confident that when the grassroots continues to mobilize and stand up and fight for economic justice, we are going to pass a $15 an hour minimum wage, building the millions of units of affordable housing that we need in this country. And when we talk about, one of the things that the role that we can play and that you are playing and that we are all playing is forcing discussion about issues that the establishment does not want discussed. And it's not only that we have the highest rate of childhood poverty of almost any major country on earth. You got working people today in Vermont, all over this country. They're going to work. It is not too much to ask that they have affordable, quality child care for their children. Our jobs is to force discussion on issues that are not only right, but in fact what the American people want. 70% of the American people supporting Medicare for all, ending in all of its many and varied forms institutional racism. Hundreds of thousands of Americans are behind bars. Do you know why they're behind bars? They're behind bars because they cannot afford bail, legalized possession of marijuana. Racial disparities, it is not just criminal justice. It is health disparities. It is housing disparities. It is wealth disparities. It is education disparities. And when we stand together and begin addressing these issues, not only are we doing the work of justice, in many ways we're creating jobs, we're bringing our people together. I know this is an issue that you will be discussing over the weekend. And we're here to talk about sexism, we're here to talk about homophobia, we're here to talk about religious bigotry, and I know we're also going to be talking about this war on undocumented immigrants. But even here, despite Trump's demagoguery on this issue, I want everybody here to know that poll after poll shows that the American people are in a very different place than Donald Trump. 80% of the American people think we should provide legal protection to the 1.8 million young people in the DACA program or eligible for DACA. A majority of the American people believe in comprehensive immigration reform and a path toward citizenship. The overwhelming majority of the American people do not support the Citizens United Supreme Court decision. And people want us to move toward public funding of elections, and we're seeing progress. Is Trump's relationship to Putin and Saudi Arabia just based on his governmental judgment regarding governmental policy, or is there something more there regarding financial interest as well? The president thinks that his administration did a brilliant job in Puerto Rico after the terrible hurricane there. I think his administration will start answering some questions about a not-so-wonderful job. Strong legislation is going to start passing the House and come to the Senate. And it is a very different situation when you don't have to deal with anything, when you don't have to vote against raising the minimum wage because you don't have a bill on your desk, than when that bill comes over. And you're going to have to explain to the folks back home why you voted no. I hope very much. We worked on a 4-year Medicare for all single-payer program. First year was pretty simple. It said lower the eligibility age for Medicare from 65 to 55, cover all of the children, lower the cost of prescription drugs. I hope our colleagues in the House bring that bill over to the Senate. And my guess is that 80% of the American people support that. And if the senators want to vote against it, they're going to have to explain that to the folks back home. No time at all to transform our energy system away from fossil fuel, or we're going to see irreparable harm done to this planet. What we have seen, the tragedy that we have seen in California, 85 people dead, 14,000 housing units destroyed, What they are telling us is if we do not get our act together, that is going to become commonplace, not just in the United States, but all over the world. Rising sea levels, flooding, the acidification of the ocean, common sense gun safety legislation, whether it is making sure that our kids can afford to go to college and not leave school $50,000 or $100,000 in debt, whether it's immigration reform, whether it is criminal justice reform, whether it is telling the billionaires that they're not going to get a tax break, but in fact they're going to start paying their fair share of taxes. Whether it is any of those issues and even more, I want you all to know that the American people are with us. We have got to make sure that the Democratic Party is not just a party of the East Coast and the West Coast. It is a party of every state in this country. Our job is to bring our people together around a strong, progressive agenda that speaks to the needs of all. We need your ideas. So thank you all very much.
The Sanders Institute was founded on the belief that a vital democracy requires an informed electorate, civil discourse, and bold progressive ideas. And that's what this gathering is about.
President Jimmy Carter, to Jane O'Meara Sanders and David Driscoll. Thank you for your kind invitation to attend the Sanders Institute inaugural gathering in Burlington, Vermont. Although I cannot be with you today, I send my best wishes for a successful conference. It is gratifying to know that you have brought together some of the world's eminent experts to generate new ideas and action strategies to advance human well-being. In just a few days, we will celebrate the 70th anniversary of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. When the United Nations was founded in 1945, we expected that the UN Charter would lay the foundation for global peace. And 3 years later, the Declaration would inspire a movement for human rights throughout the world. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had earlier articulated the 4 freedoms which Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt built upon when she led the American effort at the newly established organization to codify a comprehensive compact on human freedom, one that would encompass the freedom of expression and belief, alongside the equally essential freedom from want and freedom from fear. The recognition of the obligations of government to fulfill these rights was a defining and revolutionary act. Now, the legitimacy of those in power would be judged by the degree to which they delivered on the promise of peace, equality, and an adequate standard of living for all. When I was elected President of the United States, I placed a high priority on these objectives by pursuing peace through diplomacy in the Middle East, by signing human rights treaties, and supporting democratic movements. I also prioritized civil rights, criminal justice reform, healthcare, women's equality, and renewable energy, believing that advances in these areas would enhance the human rights of those in our own country. A global movement grew consistently over the next decades. Unfortunately, policies later adopted in the United States resulted in exponential growths in wealth inequality, political corruption, and worsening conditions for many Americans. After the terrorist attacks on the United States in 2001, many of the gains that had been made in the human rights movement were lost. Torture and indefinite detention were embraced by our own government. Fundamental human rights were violated in the name of national security. The rise of authoritarian leaders around the world threatens to further normalize an approach to governance that relies on fear and alienation instead of the ideals that give humanity hope. Therefore, your undertaking could not be more timely. We must build a world together that rests firmly on a foundation of the enduring principles found in the Declaration of Human Rights, that every person is equal in dignity and rights, and that we can face every challenge and solve the most intractable problems as long as we stay true to this universal creed. Rosalind joins me in sending our best wishes for success in your efforts. Sincerely, Jimmy Carter.
The nurses had early endorsed him. And I remember thinking, wow, These are some crazy badass nurses. They truly are infinite game players. They understand the long-term game and investing in ideas and making sure that we can bring it to reality.
It takes teamwork to make the dream work. And we are going to be a team for a very long time. Medicare for all, when you got to talk to your family, your friends, your neighbors, your play cousins, when you want people to understand what is at stake, just tell them only all that we love is on the line. People who are suffering in this country because policymakers have decided to answer to their donors, and not answer to the people. Inspire other people to understand that the tax dollars belong to us. It's our money. This is about a social contract. Nurses know babies die, that poor mamas and daddies who struggle every single day cannot afford to pay health care for their health care. Health care is a moral right, a moral obligation in this country that has economic benefits too.
In the 1930s, we had mass unemployment, but we don't have unemployment during the war. If you could have full employment killing Germans, why can't you have full employment by building hospitals, by building schools, recruiting nurses, recruiting teachers? If you can find money to kill people, you can find money to help people. Unprecedented levels of social and economic inequality have brought us to the brink of fascism. At its core, fascism combines enormous economic discontent caused by neoliberalism with the crisis of white supremacy and a deep sense of emasculation. The underlying theme of our panel is this: Medicare for all and its recent growth in popularity is intricately linked to a much broader fight for participatory democracy and against proto-fascism and its highly toxic radicalization of the right. Yes, Medicare for all guarantees health care for everyone. Yes, it also delinks health care from employment status, restoring enormous industrial power to working people. But what our enemies fear most is this: Medicare for all gives a fifth of our economy back to the people and increases the size, strength, and power of our democratic government.
70% of Americans now support expanding Medicare to guarantee coverage for everyone, including half of all Republicans. Commercial insurers don't compete to deliver better care at a lower cost for people with costly needs, and never will. It's not in their financial interest. Think about it. When was the last time you heard Aetna or United Health boast about its great cancer or stroke care, or say, join us if you have heart disease? In New York, not a single plan on the state health insurance exchange includes Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. Why not? To maximize profits, commercial insurers want to keep people with cancer from signing up with them. Where's the health plan that says if you need costly care, you can use top doctors and hospitals with low costs? That's the one we all want. That's Medicare for all. You can't get that from a commercial health plan. In fact, you have no clue what you're getting. Only if there's a single payer, as with Medicare for all, can you pool and broadly distribute risk, drive down costs, and guarantee everyone good coverage. The perils of offering everyone a choice between commercial insurance and a public option. Because the commercial Medicare Advantage insurers shift costs to people who are in poor health and keep out-of-pocket costs low for people who are healthy, healthier people choose them, leaving traditional Medicare with sicker enrollees and driving up its costs. We might think of these commercial for-profit Medicare Advantage plans as corporate take-advantage plans that take advantage of taxpayer dollars and undermine the traditional Medicare program.
Canadian Medicare guarantees health care to all their residents. It is publicly administered, comprehensive in coverage, universal, portable, and free at the point of care. Nevertheless, Canada is the only developed country in the world with a universal healthcare system that does not cover essential prescription medications prescribed outside of a hospital. Because of this, patients actually try to be admitted into hospitals to receive desperately needed medications. Coupled with the greed of the multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical industry, this system has made drug prices in Canada the third most expensive in the world. The result is that 1 in 5 Canadian families cannot afford their prescription medications. This is why nurses, along with the Canadian Labour Congress and other advocacy groups, have come together to launch a campaign for national pharmacare, a single-payer, universal prescription drug program for all Canadians, which will save Canada about $4.2 billion each year. The only thing that stands in the way of us winning Medicare for all in the United States is a lack of this political and moral will. But this collective will is growing, as we saw by the astonishing number of pro-Medicare for all candidates who won during the midterms. We know that these industries will line the pockets of the shape-shifting extreme center of the Democratic Party in an endeavor to sabotage our efforts with a public option.
Jeremy Corbyn was asked why he thinks socialism would work in Britain. His answer? Look at the basis of our most valued institution, the NHS. The NHS is based on the socialist principle of access according to need, not ability to pay. This is the heart and soul of the NHS. It is no exaggeration to say that this British institution is revered and is more of a national obsession than a great cup of tea. Of all the forms of inequality, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhumane. 42% of Americans have depleted their entire life's assets a mere 2 years after being diagnosed with cancer. Jeremy Corbyn inspired me to dedicate my late evenings to campaigning and multiple meetings in very cold community halls, fueled by cups of tea and biscuits. The good news story is that I haven't been alone. In this nursing union of nearly 500,000 members, the executive resigned over the summer due to grassroots anger at the way the union sold the new NHS pay deal to its members. It is at the grassroots that these battles will be won. There is now a real thirst in our countries for truth and for heart and soul politics. Universal healthcare truly is the beating heart of a civilized society. Shake your chains to earth like dew, which in sleep had fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few.
When we have a credible plan to win and can invite people to get to work on a bold goal, we have a shot at building a volunteer army capable of overpowering corporate interests and the conservatism of establishment politicians. 1/3 of the UK's Facebook users were reached by Momentum-made content over the 6-week election period. The focus of all of these organising efforts was to reach out to people who are usually excluded from the political process, listen to their concerns, and invite them to join us in the fight to solve them. To do this, Momentum trained volunteer canvassers in persuasion techniques that went beyond the usual data collection. Canvassers found that this dialogue-focused approach immediately broke down barriers on the doorstep and fostered a sense of solidarity in the face of political challenges which often alienate and isolate people. The scale of the volunteer effort mobilised by big organising and the big political vision on offer meant that Momentum could ignore the conventional wisdom of only canvassing a small number of people, previously identified voters in key seats, but instead attempted to engage and interact with as many people as possible. Active solidarity. Many of the big organising techniques utilised and refined by Momentum were pioneered on the Bernie campaign. Some of these reached the UK thanks to Becky Bond and Zach Exley's excellent book, Rules for Revolutionaries. Others were brought by organisers from the Bernie campaign who travelled to the UK to help, recognising the commonality in our political struggles. This is what solidarity looks like. The Union have identified key congressional targets that we need to win over in order to progress the Medicare for All bill through the House. During the second week of February, supporters in those districts will organise barnstorms. These mass organising meetings focus on putting people to work and will be used to recruit people to start door knocking and applying pressure on their recalcitrant representatives. Supporters outside of those districts will recruit volunteers to set up peer-to-peer text and phone banks calling into the key districts, thereby harnessing people power from across the nation, strategically targeted to maximise impact. This is how we will win Medicare for All, by building a people-powered movement at such a scale that it can overpower corporate interests and establishment politicians.
In order to reach 200,000 non-union RNs, I keep saying that number because it's shocking to me, we accessed publicly available RN lists, we compared it to the voter file, we created these contact lists. We then had these texting communication with this relay program. We were able to identify close to 17,000 nurses who wanted to be involved and 3,000 who wanted to be leaders in the campaign. Without unions, our ability to exercise power is seriously constrained. So unions need to have a plan for how we are going to engage the 93% of private sector workers who don't currently have collective bargaining. Both political parties seek to concentrate power into the hands of an increasingly smaller number of multinational corporations and libertarian institutions. These ideologies that focus on individual advantage and reward selfishness make no room for collective well-being. In Florida, we held 11 meetings. In Texas, we held 5. Those nurses in those meetings discussed a local plan, and then they reached out to this militant minority that we had identified to engage them further in the campaign. We held trainings specific to the campaign, and we've scheduled additional trainings on how to communicate and organize around Medicare for All. Each county will be part of the overall campaign, participating in the national strategy. But they will also create their own local plan for their region. The idea is that everyone agrees to a common set of principles, and then they get trained to be a leader in the campaign. But locally, people do creative actions so that nurses can build their own local organization. These local actions can really be almost anything, including meetings with local electeds, attending public hearings, town halls, barnstorms, passing city and county resolutions in support of Medicare for All, holding demonstrations, leafleting public areas, farmers markets, libraries, essentially anything that helps them to build organization locally.
Join us. This is an open source campaign. The idea is that everybody here gets their boots on the ground.
We're going to learn about it in just a moment. Let me say one quick thing about this topic. How to pay for Medicare for All? Are you kidding? How do you pay for a system that is twice the cost, almost 19% of GDP, bankrupting businesses, putting a huge hole in government spending, of course, bankrupting households? We have the most overpriced, inequitable, and inefficient system in the world. We're wasting hundreds of billions of dollars. We spend far more than any other high-income country and get less for it. So the issue cannot be how do you pay for something that is cheaper, more efficient, and more fair.
And I have to fix it, and like 19 times after it, and they said, well, maybe. So that's how it got to be decent, but it still wasn't really that good. And then we showed it to the reviewers, including Jeff Sachs, who were also pains in the ass. And they all had like 7 pages of things that had to be fixed. Jeff had about 18 pages of things that needed to be fixed. And so we fixed them. And that took a year and a half.
An objective, unbiased, comprehensive, and thorough economic analysis of Medicare for All. Professor Poland and his co-authors have set a new high standard for transparency and clarity in presenting their analyses, estimations, and conclusions. The research methods they used to estimate both the cost increases and the savings are sound. The assumptions they used to generate cost estimations are based on the latest empirical evidence. Consequently, William Schau says, the conclusions of the study on the overall cost and savings of Medicare for All are reasonable and scientifically sound. That sounds good. Remarking on this approach and methodology and the significance of the study, another reviewer, Alison Galvani of the Yale School of Public Health, said, "This stellar economic analysis of a single-payer universal healthcare system for the U.S. is the first to sufficiently document each step of the calculations, enabling reproducibility of the findings. It's also the first study that thoroughly addresses the transition to and financing of a universal healthcare system for the U.S. Underlying the analysis is an interdisciplinary evidence base that has been compiled from literature spanning economics, health policy, and clinical care both within the U.S. and internationally. The methodology is sound and the assumptions are conservative with regard to their conclusions. Specifically, lower-end figures from the expert literature are used in the calculation of savings, whereas anticipated expenditures are based on the higher end of empirical distributions. So she says, despite stacking the deck against Medicare for All, this analysis convincingly demonstrates the substantial improvements in cost efficiency that could be achieved by Medicare for All. Overall, Medicare for All is expected to reduce national health expenditures. And specifically, your study shows that, and that was Galvani's review, I would add, specifically, your study shows that Senator Sanders' Medicare for All Act can provide universal coverage of every resident in the United States as the system as a whole absorbs a 12% increase in demand for health services. More people getting coverage are going to use more care, but it still realizes a 19.2% in potential cost savings overall. That and the cost of prescription drugs under your approach would be lowered by 40%. Everyone is covered with comprehensive benefits. All commercial insurance premiums, copays, and deductibles are eliminated. That's no cost sharing. And overall, we save 9.6% in costs over the present system.
Less days lost, and less anxiety, less bankruptcies. The biggest winners in this system are the middle-class households, especially if people are paying either out of pocket or through an individual health insurance program. Now, we have them saving 14% of income. In other words, their income goes up effectively by 14% through the establishment of Medicare for All. Whatever businesses are paying in premiums today, the day after Medicare for All comes in, they all pay 8% less. How are they getting more than 8%? So I had to reread it, and the reason is because we estimated their administrative costs, and they're saving on administrative costs. So on top, those administrative costs are meaningful. It's wasteful, but they have to do it, and they're done. 30% of us are what we call underinsured. So what does it mean to be underinsured? Well, you have health insurance, but it is not adequate, so that people don't want to go into, these are like the stories we heard in the last session. They don't want to go in because it costs too much. That's basically it. So they don't go in, and then their health conditions are exacerbated. And so then they wait till they need surgery, and you have to spend $25,000 in surgery as opposed to spending, $80 for a visit. So that is a big source of savings. And we didn't cost that out, fill out forms. And for physicians, we said they're going to save 4 hours a week. And those 4 hours can go to treatment, which, by the way, means that the people get better care and you get to see your provider. It also means that they can make more money. These are billable hours. All of the major insurers' pension funds are currently solvent, so they have to stay solvent. They get 100% wage insurance for a year, which is over double what we normally give in unemployment insurance in the country. Plus they get retraining support, plus they get relocation support. So those are absolutely critical features. And to the credit of the authors of the bill in the Senate, Senator Sanders and the people that work with him, they do include that. They include the just transition as a feature. Now, they don't cost it out. We costed it out. And it turns out, when we costed it out, our number was basically the same as what's in the bill. Maybe they did cost it out. It so happens I have also done research around the Green New Deal and the job part of the Green New Deal. I've also done research on the military spending and jobs. Once you get rolling with these boring statistical models, and it gets fun, and you just keep going. The transition to a green economy is going to create about 4 million jobs. You spend $1 million in the military, you'll create 11 jobs. If you spend $1 million in education, you'll create 23 jobs on average. Yeah. So yes, if we shift out of military spending into other activities, you can create more jobs. If we take the average, if we shift out of the military and then just spend it all on everything in general, you're going to go from 11 jobs to about 14 jobs.
They have taken untold millions that they never told to earn, but without our brain and muscle, not a single wheel would turn. We can break their haughty power, gain our freedom when we learn that the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong.
Power of workers is the only thing that stands between our democracy and having a completely corporate-run government. And I think there's a straight line between the current political moment and the fact that all three branches of government are bought and owned by the corporate class. I think that's a direct result of both Republican assault on workers and Democratic. 35% of private sector workers were in unions, right? That was the height of union power, and it was a progressive moment in our country, right, where we were able to move an agenda that improved the lives of every American. But since then, right, there's been a sharp decline in union density, and now less than 6% of private sector workers are in unions. And the challenge for all of us, if we are to realize the vision that the Sanders Institute is giving us space to articulate, if we are to realize that vision, I think it is imperative that we do everything possible to increase the number of workers in unions. They went out on strike, and they forced the president to champion labor law reform. The passage of the Wagner Act in 1935 led to a surge of 3 million new workers in unions, right? We need labor law reform. But even more significantly, President Roosevelt used his executive power. Not only did he use the power of the bully pulpit to move Congress to pass labor law reform, he used his executive powers. He said, if you want to do business with the United States government, you have to have a collective bargaining relationship. He signed that executive order in 1941, and with that stroke of the pen, President Roosevelt put $10 million workers into unions, right? It was a combination of both legislative action and executive action. And if we are to create the progressive moment that we're all committed to building, right, it's incumbent on us to continue to organize workers, to stand with workers who are on the picket lines.
I don't know if the nurses are still here. I got a confession to make. My mother was not a nurse. Fighting for the public good. That's what the nurses are doing when they're fighting through their union for Medicare for all.
Right.
It ties in the rights and the benefits and the opportunities to do their jobs, and it ties into the needs of the community to have health care as a human right. So one is, I think, if the labor movement is going to be true to this topic, then we have to be defenders of the public good. And brothers and sisters, let me divert just a minute. It's not automatic that the labor movement is on the side of democracy. It depends whether our unions, whether the workers control the union, whether the workers are involved, and whether the leaders are accountable to the people. Good Senator Bernie Sanders for being one of the most ferocious fighters to defend the public post office. He used to be a postal bank in this country for 66 years. And if you talk to some people that are older than me, and I'm on the older side myself, you'll find people that actually banked at the Postal Service. Many countries around the world, the post office provides postal banking. Now, why not have a public option for banking? There's a huge social problem, or I should say in this setting, a huge social problem. Close to 80 million people don't have access to basic banking. We're fighting for vote by mail everywhere. Yes. And, you know, some people may say, well, that's selfish. You're the president of the American Postal Workers Union. You just want more letters in the mail. Well, we welcome more letters in the mail. But the reality is, and again, many of us are speaking to the choir, voter suppression is so deep.
Senator Sanders who's hiding from us, but
the rapid response work that the NUNU does when there's a disaster is really some pretty good examples of the kind of work that a progressive trade union movement can do. Instead of just giving money to a place that is undergoing a disaster, they actually send help and physical resources and provide real sustenance and energy and support for folks. We really appreciate the work that Senator Sanders did on behalf of workers in the state of Vermont. But not only that, during his presidential campaign, from my perspective, it was not just a presidential campaign, it was a literacy campaign. It was an economic literacy campaign. And he gave the whole country an amazing lesson on the economics and how things work. And for us, that value and what it has brought to this country is really pretty substantial. And what he's done, one of the things that Bernie so eloquently gave to all of us who are not in the trade union movement, who may not work in a factory, is the role and the central role that unions play. It really is quite incredible for me when we spend half of our waking lives in a factory, in a workplace, because one of the third we're sleeping, theoretically, and yet it is in an anti-democratic, authoritarian environment completely. You know, when 93% of the private sector workers work in a non-union setting, that means 93% of that population is going to work in a dictatorship every day. And it is long known in the union movement, all those of us who work in the union know when we first started, democracy stops at the door. And it is an accepted fact in this country that when you walk through a door into a workplace, you lose all the democratic rights that we have in the street. You lose your freedom of assembly, you lose your freedom of speech, you use your freedom to redress and to file grievances. Now, theoretically, according to the labor law, Section 7 in particular, the Labor Act, you have the right to do that. But the practical reality is we don't. From 1935 to 1947, when Taft-Hartley was passed, the labor movement tripled in size, from 5 million people to 15 million workers. From 1947 until today, it has essentially remained flat. That if you work half of your life in a dictatorship, how does that not spill over into our broader community, into the collective psyche of the United States.
Trump tricked them. Let's face it. He tripped them with Bernie's message in the campaign about the working class. So when we get into the next campaign, whatever that campaign is, we have got to mobilize. Working people are the most powerful force on earth.
Unions and the working class needs to be political as hell. Flint water. You know, postal workers live in Flint and work in Flint. So, look, the last time I checked, the Koch brothers are political as hell.
Right.
Wall Street's political. The pharmaceuticals are political. And then people tell us, unions, workers, don't be political. Mm-hmm. So we have to be more political. And I have some views that, you know, I think part of our problem as the working class is we are functioning right now and facing a lesser of two evil duopoly. And I don't know any other way to put it. And it doesn't mean that there aren't good individuals who are really on the side of working people within the Democratic Party, and maybe even here and there within the Republican Party. But the institutions, the political parties have failed, absolutely failed the working class. And I tell people, you know, when it comes to, you know, elect anybody with a D by their name and all this, let's take off our rose-colored glasses, right? It's the party of mass incarceration. It's the party of mass deportation. It's the party of wars of regime change. It's the parties of bloated military budgets. It's the party of enriching the pharmaceuticals instead of health care for all. Party of NAFTA. It's the party of NAFTA. And these rotten trade deals. And so we need a way out. And my feeling is, listen, if you don't know it, I'll tell you. The working class is done with the status quo and business as usual in this country. And they are rightfully done. Now, what direction it goes in, that's what's up for grabs. So what happened in the last election is what was the pundit said. It's going to be Jeb Bush and Hillary Clinton. Last time I checked, it's neither. And what I think in part drove the wonderful Sanders campaign, besides the aspirational message to the U.S. working class and uplifting people's standards, and you know, the idea that we're worth more, right? We're worth everything. But part of it was that people were done.
Over the course of the Fight for 15 in Washington, D.C., Good Jobs Nation, we did 20-plus strikes. It was Senator Sanders, it was Keith Ellison, and it was other members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus who led that movement, who stood up to the centrist Democrats who actually didn't support the Fight for 15 in the Union and said this is the right thing to do. Right? That's the battle, right, that we've got to engage, because Trump is, you know, we spent a lot of time, I went to probably about a dozen Trump rallies with laid off manufacturing workers this summer ahead of the midterms, right? These are the workers that Trump betrayed. He went and said, I'm going to save your jobs. Well, GM Lordstown, thousands of workers are on the streets as of this week. Those workers are angry, right? And they understand that Donald Trump is not going to be, right, the champion that he promised he's going to be. And that's why I think as we move into this next moment, we don't need more centrism. We don't need more half-baked economic ideas, right? We need full-throated economic populism. We need to make sure that we grow the American labor movement. We need to make sure that we have candidates like Senator Sanders who stand on the side of workers and struggle, because that will make all the difference between winning or losing in 2020 and whether we realize the progressive vision that we all want for health care for all, for a green climate.
Bernie was the lead sponsor of a bill that turned out to be the first new federal housing program in decades, the National Housing Trust Fund, which many of us fought for. And thank you for that, Bernie. I really appreciate it.
By the way, the other co-sponsor, that was Barbara Lee of California. People all across this country who are born and raised in a neighborhood who are being driven from those neighborhoods, losing the ability to maintain contact with folks that they grew up with and that they love. We are the wealthiest country in the history of the world. That we are a nation that spends $700 billion on the military, more than the next 10 nations combined, that we just gave $1 trillion in tax breaks to the top 1%, and that when Wall Street crashed because of their greed and illegal behavior, somehow it just happened that not only that Congress came up with a huge bailout, but the Fed was there to provide zero-interest loans to central banks all over the world. So if there is a crisis in affordable housing or in childcare or in any place else, the reason is not lack of resources, the reason is lack of political will. And the reason is a set of priorities determined by the wealthiest people in this country and large campaign contributors, not working families.
We have a housing crisis in this country and nobody talks about it. And I really hope that today is the day that we come together in this progressive movement and change that and start giving to the people that we all are working with and understanding that they have a human right to housing. They have an entitlement to decent housing, that housing is not something that's just for people to profit from, but in fact something that we need to provide for all our residents and citizens.
There's no investment in anything. There's no public schools, there's no housing, there's nothing except for what some of the activists have done. So how can we get in these areas where, as I go 20 minutes from Chicago to work with that community, the stores that are there have triple thick bulletproof glass. Mm-hmm. And that's how people are living. And there's 2,500 people shot this year alone. How can we get any investment in areas like that that are so desperately needing it, so desperately needing what you're offering, the most blighted communities? So I was wondering how that's transferable to different cities like Chicago.
Okay. So why are the banks to loan there?
No, the banks won't loan to anybody.
But even with bank financing, you need equity, which only the government can provide. So I would say this is the other side of the coin of gentrification and the financialization of all housing markets. That when there's disinvestment, you can't get capital there, and our government programs follow that. But the only reason anybody will come and invest in your neighborhood is if it's got gentrification potential and they're speculating. So we need to have housing programs that are based on need and based on where people live and based on where communities want to provide and secure their housing and preserve housing for their people, instead of programs that follow these market principles, which are completely contrary to the purpose of housing. In housing was always commodified, but in the 80s, it really got financialized with those instruments. And what the financial crash really showed was what a pyramid scheme the market is. And if our government programs follow that, they're going to waste money or make it worse. And the thing about the financial crisis is that it was a huge transfer of wealth from our affordable, low-income neighborhoods back to Wall Street. Herein lie the seeds of the progressive housing policy that is now taking hold for the grassroots around the country in sort of a housing justice movement that is recognizing that we can no longer be fooled, and by our government programs which feed this, that somehow the market is going to solve our housing problems. We as communities have to take hold of community-based, community-owned housing that can take many, many forms and serve a variety of local needs, but with partnership of government. And the one thing we need, as Bernie said, we still have a housing crisis in Vermont. We are really just held back by the lack of affordable capital coming into this and investment into this. And if the federal government today spent on permanently affordable housing what they spent in the 70s on developers to develop housing that would be affordable for 10 years or 15, we would have the resources to meet this issue at scale. If they could collectively buy the land, it's a power they could never have individually. to fight the pressures sometimes of governments or developers coming in. And so it's a model that offers a tremendous amount of flexibility to local need. We have co-ops on ours, we have rentals, we have special needs housing, we have shelter, we have parks, we have community facilities and community centers and things like that. So in other places, they're doing urban agriculture and community land, just whatever your community needs. But that place will be in the hands of your people.
It's gotten worse and worse and worse. I travel across the globe. Our organization, the largest AIDS organization in the world, we're in 42 countries. I have never seen more homelessness than in the city of Los Angeles. City of Los Angeles is the homeless capital of the world. The #1 economic justice issue, economic inequality issue in American cities, and those are small ones and large ones, is housing. A home is the biggest investment for most people. And the most equity they have in life is that home. So they're very zealously guarding that. So I think we do have to address the issue. But the converse is, if we have 53,000 homeless people in Los Angeles now, what happens when it's 500,000? What are the property values going to be like? What's the quality of life going to be like? Do we really want to live in a place where it's survival of the fittest? When you plunk a luxury building into a working class area, everything around it becomes gentrified. And it's frustrating for me to hear Democratic Party politicians subscribing to trickle down. You got to get the dirty money out of the politics at the local level. A city council person should not be able to take a contribution from a developer today and vote on their project tomorrow. And I'll say this, when we're talking about inclusionary zoning in luxury buildings, we shouldn't settle for 5%. It should be a third. Repeal a law called the Costa-Hawkins law. And this law exists in 47 states. What happened in the 70s and 80s was that the state legislatures, under the domination of real estate interests, decided to take the power away from localities and give it to the state. It said, you cannot extend rent control past 1995, anywhere in California. And if you already have a rent control law in place, it's frozen. So in Los Angeles and San Francisco, it's frozen at 1978 and 1979. And we couldn't get it out of the first committee in the democratically controlled legislature in California. The Democrats are the ones who run the biggest cities in this country. And they have been involved in multi-billion-dollar giveaways to the real estate interests. We've bought 4 single-room occupancy hotels. Most of those rooms were empty because the real estate speculators were holding on to them, right? We bought them, and we've taken people and put them from the sidewalk into a decent, respectful place to live. On the other hand, the city program, and this costs an average, by the way, of $70,000 per unit. Nothing fancy, but decent, right? On the other hand, the city program, which is part of the whole affordable housing industrial complex, is spending $500,000 per unit to house one person. We got to cut out the speculation. We got to crack down on Airbnb. That's taking away a lot of housing stock. We got speculative building where people have empty units that they're stockpiling. We should tax them like Vancouver. People who live here, not people who are, moving their money from, one or another despotic country.
As somebody who has dealt with Amazon, Amazon. What you got, and I speak as a former mayor as well. All right? Every mayor in this country wants decent paying jobs for his or her constituents. But what you have are companies like Amazon, which are incredibly wealthy, incredibly powerful, and in an outrageous way. And let's be clear about it. What Amazon says to every city in America, every state in America, nothing new. Nissan said the same thing. You want good automobile jobs? We got thousands of jobs for your community, says Nissan, to Mississippi and Tennessee and Alabama, non-union states. All right, what are you going to give us? I got thousands of jobs here. How many tax breaks are you going to give me? All right, you're going to train your workers, you're going to rebuild the infrastructure. So you got communities all over this country that are being blackmailed. You know, mayors want to do the right thing. But all over this city, all over this country, you got communities that are being blackmailed by a handful of multinational corporations. Now, there are ideas that are out there to level this playing field and to say to Amazon and everybody else, you cannot play one community off against the other. And that for every tax break you get, we're going to raise your federal taxes. Somebody who never goes through picket lines, I did walk through a picket line in front of City Hall, where the real estate people were there on the night that we voted for the land trust.
Before I was mayor, I was a poor, young, a black child on the south side of Stockton with an incarcerated father and a mother who had me at 16 years old as a teenager. So the things we fight for, like affordable health care, affordable child care, entitlement programs like WIC and Head Start, all paved the way for me to be on the stage today. So I want to start by thanking all of you, the activists, the thinkers, the organizers, for creating a world responsible for creating life maps and creating goals, or responsible for keeping the peace. So it's like a job. But again, the investment is that every time there's a shooting, it costs our city and county $500,000. So a small $1,000 stipend to reward somebody for getting back on track, to reward somebody for doing the right thing, for providing a job or opportunity is the best investment we can make. People are working. Like, that's why we have a whole term called the working poor. 44% of poor people work full-time. There's people driving Uber, Lyft, door dashing, working, doing childcare, and still can't pay bills. And oftentimes the controversy is around this concept we have of the dignity of work. And I would argue that a person's dignity is not attached to work or what they produce, but it's attached to their humanity.
It's our job to make people uncomfortable. You can't uneducate a person that has learned to read. You cannot put down a person that feels proud. And you cannot control a person that feels no fear. It isn't my agenda as mayor that's important. It's about the people's agenda. And it is about how we provide a platform in government for people to make their dreams come true. This is not poetry, this is reality. I was never gonna get elected unless I was elected under a coalition of people. So I spoke to everyone that every other politician had put aside. By a legislation that was passed by the current government of Puerto Rico, the right to collect a bargain was taken away from all the Puerto Rican public servants. So I had to go to court 4 times, not one, 4 times, until the Supreme Court of Puerto Rico acknowledged the right of the municipality of San Juan to afford its employees the opportunity to decide whether they wanted to be represented or not. 3,000 of us died because a man didn't have the heart to do his job, because he turned his backs on us, and the political class in Puerto Rico, for the major part of it, decided to play along. When we don't do our job in making others feel uncomfortable when they don't do theirs, people die.
I'm a renter, and my rent has increased by 30% only this year, and I'm the mayor, so forces constructors to make 30% of all new housing affordable. Vulture investments funds are not welcome in Barcelona.
New York City joined with others. We went at the Trump administration, we sued them over trying to withhold security funding to keep people safe from cities in America like New York, because we respected the rights of immigrants, because we would not ask immigrants their documentation status. And when the Trump administration came out with their rule, we said that's just plain unconstitutional. Well, guess what the judge said yesterday? That's unconstitutional.
I stopped thinking about winning, and I started thinking about talking about the right thing and talking about the right people and doing the right alliances. FEMA sucks, by the way.
How does this Amazon deal reconcile with our values?
We do see an opportunity to get that from our interaction with the private sector, not always on rules that we agree with, by the way. And the final thing I'd say is, the question that Bernie raised the other day, I think, is a powerful one. There is a race to the bottom in America.
I filed in March. It wasn't part of a lifelong plan, and I brought down the Cuban Republican mafia in Northwest Miami-Dade.
Far right has a narrative that creates an enemy in foreigners.
There's actually a lot of money. It's not true that there's no money because the Spanish government rescued the banks in Spain with billions of euros, and it just gave them billions of euros for nothing in return after the crisis. And that now they say that they don't have any money for housing or for immigrants, and it's not true.
The conversations I have about progressive values oftentimes aren't with people who would call themselves progressives. I have progressive conversations with people who have O'Reilly Factor mugs. I have progressive conversations with people who probably voted for the current president. And I share that to say I think the mark of a true progressive or a true person who just wants to move the country forward is that you're willing and able to engage in a dialogue with everybody. Because whether they agree with it or not, everyone benefits from things like tuition-free college. Whether they agree with it or not, everyone benefits from things like affordable or universal Medicare for all.
Criminal injustice forum, we're going to talk about not just what ails the system in America and also in the world to a certain extent, but particularly in America, but also those things that we can do to be the difference.
The prison population has quadrupled in the last 40 years. It's not only, proportionally, it's 4 times the size. And that has to do with the war on drugs and targeting of people from minor drug offenses and largely people of color. And so there are so many things that we need to do, particularly in New York, but across the country. I would say there are 4 main ones. That ending cash bail, ensuring a right to speedy trial, ensuring right to discovery, and legalizing marijuana. And if you take legalizing marijuana just as an example, right, this is black people, white people, every color people use marijuana at the same rates, but 80% of the arrests for marijuana are of black and brown people. We have to end cash bail because what we're effectively doing, 70% of the people are locked up because they can't afford even minor amounts. New Yorkers spend $42 million on bail of amounts of less than $1,000. We spend $22,000 a year per student in New York, but we spend $70,000 to incarcerate people. Right? In New York State, we spend $118,000 to incarcerate people in New York City. And we need to invest in schools, not jails.
It's better to build strong children than to try to repair broken men.
Right. In Florida this last election with the reenfranchisement of formerly incarcerated citizens.
That's right.
You know, and an important part of that.
1.4 million.
Incarceration, as we know it in this country, is a continuation of slavery. Because when you think about it, we've got new jails on the stock market. You remember, it's the convicts who make the license plates and all that and gets paid 70 cents an hour. And I'm surrounded by all these white men in white shirts and felt hats, and Malcolm comes through the door and said, "Who is Gus Newport?" I said, "I am, sir." He said, "Young blood, you got the best tap telephone in America. This is all FBI here." We went down to the jail and got those brothers out, and then went and talked to the sheriff, went to the court, and was able to get them out. The very next day after Malcolm came to Rochester, the New York State legislature, because he spoke at a settlement house after that, a nonprofit organization, the New York State legislature passed a law that Malcolm X could not speak in any nonprofit or any government-funded institution in the state of New York. Within 24 hours, they did that. And so then Malcolm came back, and I was actually traveling with him 4 days before he was assassinated. We're doing a film on his life now because the last 3 years, he and Martin Luther King have become very close. Malcolm had moved to the civil rights movement, but history is not truly recorded in the United States of America. So you don't know about that. I reorganized the police department when I became the mayor of Berkeley because I had had some experience naturally. We hired mental health workers to work the streets with police. We bought some yellow buses, school buses, put them on our marina so that homeless people could sleep in them, put porta potties there and portable showers. We gave each of them a mailbox so that they could apply for SSI and whatever else. And I used to give them the first 30 minutes on my city council meeting, and they could use my conference room to discuss. You can't plan public policy for somebody without planning it with them. Love and approach and understanding, common respect is what is going to make the difference. And that's what I'm sure is going to come out of the Sanders Institute. I was mayor at the same time that Bernie Sanders was mayor. And he and Dennis Kucinich and I used to be invited to Eastern universities to talk about public policy because we were looking at alternatives to public policy. Bernie invited me to Burlington when he was running for governor. And we're sitting in Bernie's office, and two reporters, one from the UPI and one from the AP, pulled out this big paper. Bernie said, "What's that?" You know when those big printouts of the big punch holes in them they used to have going back to the old printers? She said, "Well, we can put a public figure's name into the computer, and we got 90 stories on Gus Newport. Bernie, we want to know why you, a Jew from Brooklyn, who's a socialist, invites Gus Newport, a former black nationalist and a socialist, to a state that's 97% white to campaign with you." And Bernie said, "Because we're going to talk about the issues."
I was thirsty and you gave me a drink. I was homeless and you gave me a room. I was shivering and you gave me clothes. I was sick and you stopped by to visit me. I was in prison and you came to see about me.
Agnostic, if you're secular, if you're atheistic, if you're Christian, if you're Islamic, if you're Buddhist or you're Hindu, at that deep human level, are you really willing to courageously engage in a quest for truth? And the condition of truth is always to allow suffering to speak. In America, it's almost impossible to talk about love because it's been commodified, commercialized, marketized. It's all sentimentalized. No, love is the most difficult thing, and yet at the same time, the most precious and the most powerful. Why is that? Because you have to have a courage to examine yourself. We've got 4,855 military units, 857 around the world, 128 countries, special operations. Pentagon gets 47 cents for every dollar. We got an empire. We got precious democratic practices in the middle of it. That's why when we founded this nation, it was an imperial democracy. Just ask our precious indigenous brothers and sisters. It was a patriarchal democracy. Ask our sisters, who are not a minority, but the majority of humanity. You see? And it was a white supremacist, slavocratic democracy. That's it. That sounds paradoxical. No, it's just contradictory. And all of us shot through with contradictions. That's what it is to be human. So we have to tell the truth. So all Jesus is saying is, right, that to be human at the highest level is to engage in a quest for our truth and unconditional love. The love includes everybody. The truth is going to begin with yourself and your society, your community, and the world, and to spread as much love as you can. Why are the criminals at the top hardly talked about? All that market manipulation, insider trading, predatory lending, fraudulent activities on Wall Street. How many of them went to jail? Not at all. Not at all. Massive corruption in government. Republicans and Democrats. Republicans are not the only gangsters.
Speak on it.
We got some gangsters in the Democratic Party. I got Marxist gangsters in Brazil. They were corrupt. They were my comrades. I still love them. I'm Christian. I love everybody. But they're wrong as they could be. Because greed is a difficult thing not to be seduced by when you're not accountable. You see, that's true for anybody in any high place. And one of the wonderful things about the politician, what we love about Brother Bernie. Right?
Yes, sir.
And we talked about that last night. Bernie's not perfect, but that brother, he has a quest for integrity such that he's less subject to wholesale corruption. If we had all the prison reform in the world and still had high levels of poverty, still had decrepit school systems, still had inadequate housing, still had dominant images of a corporate media in which you deal with conflict by killing other people, we still have a problem. My beloved is from Canada. Canada has roughly the same population as California. More Californians kill each other with knives than Canadians kill each other with anything. That's a cultural, spiritual issue. The dominant myth of America is the frontier. What was the frontier? Barbarians, civilized, moral regeneration through violence. We kill them, we kill them, we kill them, we kill them. How do we come together in a solidaristic way with strong moral and spiritual foundation? Amen. And we're not talking about perfection. All we're saying is, and this is all the black folk has ever asked for America, we want to be respected, we want to be treated fairly, and we want accountability of anybody who got power over us. That's what Democrats, small d. You see it in Whitman. You see it in Emerson. You see it in Louis Armstrong. You see it in Curtis Mayfield. You see it in Bruce Springsteen. They're Democrats on the ground. They want respect, they want fairness, and they want accountability of anybody above them. 1% of the population, they got 41% of the wealth. And the folk don't have hardly but crumbs to deal with. They're bombarded with violent images, the toxic masculinity that reinforces the male insecurity. And the women trying to deal with all of that viciousness coming at them. Thank God for the Me Too movement. We want accountability for the men who have patriarchal control. Marketized, privatized, financialized, and then militarized. If we don't have a left populist option that's credible, we headed down a neo-fascist road, I'm telling you. And a lot of it has to do with the running out of spiritual gas.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. People say, oh, if this is the way the world is, then it's just a survival of the slickest. Let me get in on the game and try to get over by any means. That's a level of spiritual emptiness that make Martin Luther King Jr. cry from the grave. And we refuse to see that go without us fighting. There's no guarantee that we're going to win. So what?
Let's do it.
Black Lives Matter movement came into being because it had to, because it was a matter of survival and life and death, but it also was greatly empowered by the technology at our disposal, by the fact of the matter that, you know, we all have phones now, and in interactions with the police and interactions on the street, we can film these things. And so it's starting to break into the national consciousness. But what we need to do is we need to be sure that the reality that's being brought to us it begins to make its way into public policy. Yes. And it's some of the issues that we've spoken about here. And we have to, as are being done in, you know, in places like Ferguson, which are so much ground zero, you know, to go out into communities and say, you must vote because there can be no police accountability and there can be no transformation of the criminal justice system until we hold those in power accountable, and if they're not going to change until we vote them out.
We must protest because we need people in the streets to be the symbol of what is wrong. That's right. We must plan. We need some folks in the back room planning. That is planning to get people elected to office who will stand up for the people, won't equivocate, and will answer to the people. And then we must persevere because this is a long-distance journey.
Absolutely.
Fulfillment of human rights is the purpose of the economy. Then we judge economic policy by looking at how it fulfills human rights. It's based on international law, right? We've talked about capitalism, socialism. We can debate about that for a long time, but international human rights law actually gives a framework by which we judge the economy. We could look at fiscal policy, monetary policy, international trade. I would be remiss to say that, you know, López Obrador is being inaugurated today in Mexico.
We have thousands of people in our country who are being poisoned by water, places like Flint, Michigan, because of a lack of investment in the right kind of infrastructure, and impacts that will continue to occur for generations unless we take action now.
We want to protect the earth because they are part of the earth, not just because they're terrified. We want to raise kids who reach out to other people because they're not terrified of the other, whether that means that you travel them or how they get out of their bubble to be able to understand that everyone deserves dignity. And it's always isolation and fear that makes people behave badly. Green New Deal, whatever we can do to create those boxes that have to be checked off as you choose your candidate to run.
I was in Georgia and Troy Davis was being executed. And my old church in Harlem was watching Democracy Now! Everybody gathered together. And Amy and I were there in that field. And you know, what she does for all of us to just inject a little morality into the news, I'm deeply, deeply grateful for. You prioritize organizing from the bottom up. You prioritize controlling states. Well, eventually you control Congress because you control redistricting. You're building a bench to run for all kinds of offices across the state. Well, then you have an incredible bench to run for the federal government. And so in this moment, I would encourage us not to despair because we don't control our federal government. It's great that we've taken back the House, and I want to thank everybody who's a part of that. But we all know until you have the Senate and the presidency, you can't get a whole lot done. And we have to get a whole lot done. And I would say we have no choice but to make our cities, as Bernie did here, our counties, our states models. Models for the rest of our country. We root this movement in our cities, in our counties, in our states. And while the work will feel harder in some ways, and we'll be focused to give our $5 or our $27 to more candidates in more places and be organizing all the time and not just for the federal cycles, what we'll find is that we move further, faster.
One of the most powerful aspects of the human rights system is that it's supposed to be transparent, participatory. Economic policy making is neither. It is neither transparent or participatory. And if we say that that has to be a criterion of economic policy making, it means that we need to make sure that people understand economic policy.
The challenges that people are facing in those countries that are driving them to leave, to seek refuge, rather than simply reacting to the moment, we should be challenging ourselves to see how can we actually help provide assistance, provide aid, invest in empowering people so that they're not being driven from their homes, so that they can actually look forward to keeping their families in the place where they have lived for generations and being successful, being peaceful, being prosperous. And to your point, Radhika, I think it's so important for us to look at this economic empowerment based on human rights and needs, not consumerism and greed.
The greatest moments of Bernie's campaign for me, we were in the Ozarks. And I was getting nervous because we were about half an hour into the speech, and, you know, it's the same speech. It's a long speech. It's like the free bird of politics. Right? And everybody knows a line. They're going to yell it out. And if they're not sober, maybe not at the right time. Right? And so I think Tulsi and I were actually there together that day. And so he was approaching the place where he was going to call for the police to stop killing unarmed black women, unarmed black men. And I was getting anxious because I had just come from Detroit and Chicago. And if the response was any more tepid to that call than it had been in those cities, I was going to be off in a way that you just don't want to be off. I'm down for your people. I need you to be down for my people. And Bernie puts out the call. And the response is overwhelming. You look out through the curtain, and half the guys in deer hunting camouflage you can see were standing on their chairs with their fists in the air hollering. Let's democratize our image of us. Because there's been a big us for a very long time. It's actually like 95% of the country.
Now we have this swell of millennials and younger that are going to vote for the first time also in 2020 and are awakened because of the environment, because of especially of shootings and all of that. And our education system is not giving them a context, is not giving them history, really, from a point of view that is relevant, anyway. And they just know that we've messed up. And now they're demanding answers, and they're demanding candidates, and they're not interested in who the parties as much as the issues, which is a good thing. They're not watching mainstream media as much. The people that are coming up that are young are looking to be engaged, and I just pray that we can help them be engaged in a way that's going to last and serve the times that they're in and give them hope.
Progressive ideas can be talked about with civil discourse, and that's the way we learn. One final thing I have to say. Something happened 2 days ago that I really can't let go without talking about. Mark Lamont Hill was fired from CNN. He was fired from CNN for a speech he gave at the UN where he talked about equal rights and human rights for everybody from the river to the sea. People who didn't want to hear that tried to make it into something it wasn't. And Mark Lamont Hill paid a price. Not only did he pay a price, but civil discourse pays a price. And the ability to talk about complicated issues pays a price. If we can't talk about Israel-Palestine, if we can't talk about Syria, if we can't talk about, because you've paid a price for that, if we can't talk about race, if we can't talk about immigration policy without jumping on people who disagree and trying to make something out of it that it's not, and criminalize or weaponize our intolerance, then we all pay a price as a country. I'll never forget Bernie was meet the press one morning after having met with him and talked about issues. He said, they said, who advised you on foreign policy? And he said, Jim Zogby. And I said to my wife, holy shit. Holy shit. I said, I actually used that word. I said, and that's civil. Because I'd always been, pardon my expression, I'd always been the whore in the closet for people. I'd worked for different presidential candidates and stuff. But it was like, I don't know him. It's like, who's he? You know, whatever. Like, give me the Arab money or give me the Arab votes, but don't talk to me about, you know, I'm not going to acknowledge you publicly. Bernie had the courage to not only acknowledge me publicly, but do me and J Street and others on both sides of the issue, and then ask me to serve on the platform drafting committee, and respect the fact that I had an ability to talk about Medicare for all, and to talk about my biggest victory was we won something. We suckered the Clinton people into it, ending the death penalty, because we actually had the vote. Gus remembers it. We had the vote for it, and then they immediately called for a suspension of the vote after we were winning, because they wanted to bring their people out in caucus, because it was not Hillary's position. But what happened was, when they came back, I said to the chair, I said, well, it looks like they're back now. Have you whipped your people into line? And they were so embarrassed that they ended up saying, okay, you got it. But that sense of that Bernie was respectful of people with points of view that had not been brought together, that he tried to convene us, as we're doing this weekend, convening people of diverse points of view from a progressive side that can elevate discourse, is really what this is all about.
Hurricane Irma took out 70% of our electrical grid. And most people had not gotten their electricity back when Maria hit. Climate change is that it is real. It is not fake news. People die. And because of what is happening in the environment, they're coming stronger and closer together. So people die. We are not a theoretical case. We are what happens when you have the perfect storm. An environmental crisis preceded by a financial crisis, and then followed by a human crisis and utter violation of civil rights and human rights. The United Nations says that not having access to essential services, such as water and electricity, it's a violation of the human rights. Now, I want you to know one thing. We weren't allowed to buy lampposts and generators from countries that the United States buys it from. So while the United States bought lampposts and generators from Colombia, we weren't allowed to buy them because of a simple reason. And I think it's something that we don't like talking about, but we have to talk about. Puerto Rico is a colony of the United States. Calling it a territory, it's a euphemism for not calling it a colony. All of our financial decisions are made not in Puerto Rico, and now, since the Obama administration, we have a fiscal control board on a legislation called Promesa, which in Spanish means promise, and it was really a promise to the bondholders. It wasn't a promise to the people of Puerto Rico, and I'm sure a lot of lawmakers in the United States thought this is the way that we should take, this is the path. We have a large debt, or so they say, $72 billion, but it hasn't been audited. Here we have 7 people, 7 that have not been elected, that have a little clause in that law that's called a sovereignty clause. If they don't like any decision that the governor, the Senate or the House, or any executive order, they can give a 30-day limit to the government of Puerto Rico to change it, the largest public educational system, to cut in the next couple of years more than $300 million. What that has done is that it has taken the university credit from $54 a credit to $157 a credit. Charter schools are being put into place and vouchers are being put into place. So education, which is to me, the most egalitarian tool, has been taken away from the people of Puerto Rico. They are telling us that we need to lower our pensions. Now, mind you, the average pension in Puerto Rico is less than $1,000. A lot of people get $400. They have required more than $700 million of lowering the cost of health. Everything is controlled by the Fiscal Control Board. So whatever discussion we're going to have here, and although these 2 esteemed gentlemen have in their heart the best interest for the people of Puerto Rico, colonialism is a crime. Unions from the AFL-CIO, 327 workers, left their homes and went down to care for us, to tell the world what the real spirit of this country is about. It isn't about division. It is about unity. It isn't about calling people names or making them invisible. It is about pulling whatever you have together. And for that, I will forever be grateful. So all I ask is for a true process of self-determination. Our bond and this progressive agenda that we've all been so privileged to talk about here is something that we can take all over the world. This is a seed that has been planted that can go to every corner. So I'm so grateful, Jane and David and Bernie, because Bernie Sanders was one of the few, if not the only person, that came down, and I tell you this and I get all choked up, and walked amongst us and didn't go to a place with a lot of security. He had no security. He walked amongst us and he saw our pain and he felt it and he touched the children from El Caño Martín Peña that, you know, on a regular day when it rains, they play over water with human excrement. Today, 26,000 families are living without a sewer system. It's a big problem. Some of it is our doing. Some of it is our doing. We have to own up to that. That is the truth. But he was one of the few that just walked and said, what can I do from your point of view? He didn't pretend to know it all. He didn't pretend to tell us what we needed. He listened to everybody from every walk of life. Every voice was important to him. And for that, I will, as a mayor, but as a human, forever be grateful. And that's what we need, to talk to one another. Included in the Green New Deal is an appropriate grid for Puerto Rico. We're fossil fuel addicted. We need to be fossil fuel weaned. People have learned the value of solar power in the last year. They've learned that nobody takes it away from you. 322 days out of 365 days in Puerto Rico, we get enough sun. You know, we are an island surrounded by water, lots and lots of water, ocean water. That's a quote from the President of the United States. Taxpayers in the U.S. have to know is you've paid for the transmission part of that system to almost be totally renewed, and now the governor of Puerto Rico is going to sell that to a private entity.
The association voted to endorse this program as an alternative to austerity. Yeah, so whether they're crazy or not, they are economists, and so almost certainly nobody cares what economists think. But that was the mainstream association of economists in San Juan, $2.2 billion. And you do it every year for 30 years, and you can be emission-free, zero fossil fuel economy. And I'll get that more in a minute. We have to pay for it, yes. Puerto Rico can pay for it by itself. We're not asking for aid. We put a tax on carbon. So carbon emission tax, which is a standard tool, which starts in 2020 and escalates through 2050, and Puerto Rico becomes a 100% renewable economy in 30 years. Now, what happens when you do that, okay? Number one, as I'm going to show you in a bit more detail, it will dramatically reduce energy costs throughout Puerto Rico. Dramatically. Energy is 100% imported in Puerto Rico. It's mostly generated by diesel, and it's extremely expensive and dirty. We will get rid of that. Puerto Rico, because it imports all of its energy, has a huge import burden. It's 4 to 5% of GDP. Shipped out every year, so we'll get rid of that. We will create through this somewhere in the range of 25,000 jobs in the early stages, 80,000 jobs per year. In the later stages, it will be good for business. It will create all kinds of business opportunities by, instead of relying on imported oil and the money being shipped out back to the United States, and it has to be the United States, you can create an energy infrastructure that is domestically generated and owned by small and medium businesses. Actually, we do have a partial repayment of the existing debt. Residents in Puerto Rico now pay 20 cents per kilowatt hour. What they would pay for onshore wind is 5 cents, 5.6 cents. So 4 times more they're paying than what they could get from solar. So the opportunity is massive. Even without talking about climate stabilization, the opportunity is massive to deliver major gains in living standards by delivering reliable, cheap, renewable energy. They buy them for $300, a $1,000 bond. They squeeze Puerto Rico, they squeeze it, and they say, by the way, you owe us $1,000. You can't pay us $300, you owe us $1,000. And the control board reinforces that.
I am honored to work with a kick-ass community land trust in San Juan, Puerto Rico. It was organized by 8 barrios, 8 neighborhoods that adjoin the canal out of the Southern Civil Rights Movement in Georgia. And the first community land trust was created in Southwest Georgia in 1969 by leaders of the civil rights movement, civil rights struggle in Georgia at the time, including John Lewis, C.B. King, Shirley Sherrod, and her husband Charles. In 1984, Burlington was the first community land trust where the city government stepped forward and helped create a community land trust. 1984, first urban community land trust, first one to have the support, the active support of city government. Extraordinary. Today, there are over 250 community land trusts in the United States, including the one in Puerto Rico. It's also, the model now has jumped across the ocean from that tiny seed in Southwest Georgia, new communities incorporated. There are 200 community land trusts in England. There are 3 in Belgium. There are a couple dozen now in Canada getting started, and fledgling CLT movements in Australia and in France. They are committed to community-led development of permanently affordable housing on community-owned land. The dirty little secret about U.S. housing policy is that we lose affordable housing faster than we produce it. The genius of the community land trust approach and what they're doing in the Caño. They are attracting private development, they're trying to attract public investment, but all of that investment will stay in the community. It will not be pocketed, it will not be siphoned off. And that's true for the affordable housing as well. They have found a way to plug the hole in the leaky bucket.
Sustainable economic development, and use the co-op development method. And what we do is the municipality hires people for 6 months. We help them put together a business plan. We fund them, and if I'm going to hire a very large company to do X work, I hire the smaller company to do a portion of that work. It just makes sense, but sometimes common sense is the least common of the senses when it comes to politics and public policy. So I tell you, if I had one wish, a genie came and said, one wish as a mayor, I'd say, dredged El Caño Martín Peña. And it's something that is incredible because they can withstand any change of government.
None of the solutions that we're talking about with climate change are worth talking about if they take a long time to happen. This is a timed test, really the first timed test that humans have faced as a civilization, and the time is actually extraordinarily short. In the last few weeks, we've watched as this idea of a Green New Deal has entered public consciousness in a deeper way.
The first line of the summary of the IPCC report that what is required now is transformation of every aspect of society. In other words, a political revolution. A framework for responding to climate change that is actually a challenge to economic inequality, joblessness, economic precarity, the need for Medicare for all, and the rest of it, then actually we're going to build a much broader movement, and also a movement that will fight harder because it has so much to gain. Because not only is it not threatened by systemic change, it's hungry for it.
This nexus of corporate domination and white supremacy, I do think about, not only after Hurricane Katrina, what we could have done in terms of a Green New Deal, but I think about just the 10 short years of Reconstruction before Jim Crow and before corporate personhood started in 1886, and then the 14th Amendment became this counter wave to what could have been a transformative time in society for the positive. So when you think about migration, you got to think about people, and social movements are what drive these policies forward. And we always talk about, climate crisis is a human-made crisis. And I would actually say that it's a person-made crisis, and it's made possible by corporations who have personhoods.
The consequences probably were for the environment, they all understood. And they understood that the infrastructure that we had built around this entire way of life, that infrastructure was crumbling and we had not invested in rebuilding it. Instead, we were investing in giving corporate subsidies to corporations like GM so that they could up and move when they realized that it was a better bet for them to invest in China. And so I think it's really important for us to always focus our message around a policy that's focused on the people we want to serve.
It's not a Green New Deal, it's a green and a black and a brown and a red and a yellow and a orange, maybe not orange. New Deal happened at a time when the US was experiencing perhaps the most miserable economic downturn in its history, right? The Great Depression. This is a moonshot. This is a big, ambitious thing that we have got to do, and the clock is ticking. Congress could sit down, write a budget, dedicate resources, pass the budget, and what would happen? It would all be paid for. That's it. Do you think that's not how it works right now? There's nothing to prevent the federal government from creating as much money as it wants and paying it to someone. Again, the Republicans understand this, okay? This is Alan Greenspan. How does he know? Because his job at the Fed was to make sure that whatever payments Congress had authorized always got cleared by the government's bank, the Fed. They don't bounce government checks. It's their job to make sure that doesn't happen. So finding the money is the least critical question that we can be asking. We have to find the votes That's how you pass legislation, and that's how you pay for and fund things. You don't say, well, I have to carve out this bit of money from over here so that I can transfer it, as if there's a finite amount of money that the government can spend. And if you want to put more in this line item of the budget, you have to carve something out here. You don't. But there are good reasons to carve it out. And I think you just have to have separate fights.
When we do our movements, we talk about wages or income. We don't fight over wealth. And right now, the biggest oil companies in the world are fighting over, they understand the wealth of the green economy. The wealth, they know it's going to transition. You know, they know that you know, fossil fuels are over, and they want to control the next economy. They also know we're in the next economy. And so I think it's instructive, you know, when we have these, you know, when Amazon's like, okay, we're going to pay workers a little more, and at the next day, we're going to set up Amazon stores that have no people. Because they're fighting over wealth, and we're fighting over income. And in this Green New Deal, we have to shift wealth and make sure that we own it, that we run it. Remarkable that their name is Beyond Petroleum. Like, that should signal what they intend to do with our, you know, new Green New Deal. Being right is not the way to win. Getting people to care and then getting people to take deeper action is how we win, and we only do that through cultural power, through intersectionality, and through, like, talking to each other in real ways that are humble and kind.
Egypt is the second biggest recipient of military aid. And when we talk about military aid, it's interesting because the test case for modern monetary theory is actually the military. And what a lot of folks don't realize is that is a glorified jobs program, because what we give to Egypt are tanks that are manufactured in the United States. That's how this thing works. And one of the biggest recipients of our military aid happens also to be one of the world's biggest producers of oil. And what we're talking about right now is a system where instead of actually leveraging this approach to thinking about what a Keynesian economics can do in a moment for Americans, what we're doing is using it to protect oligopolies by financing and feeding a system of making war in the United States to ship abroad, rather than leveraging this system of economics to actually create jobs for people at home that actually free us from the consequences of climate change and rebuild the infrastructure.
Create intense political pain for some of these corporations. Like, we need to make an example out of some of these corporations. I think Exxon's a great one that could actually be dechartered or taken out. They shouldn't be in business anymore. When I think about how close we were as a movement to eliminating some of the largest tobacco companies on the planet, when they admitted, hey, we're killing people and targeting children and killing children, and they were almost dissolved. And so we have to see the political imagination around, like, what is a world without Exxon?
Good news, which is that the divestment campaign, which Naomi helped kick off, just has passed in the last few days the $7 trillion mark around the world with and Goldman Sachs, in one of its analysis 2 weeks ago, said that the divestment campaign had dropped the value of coal stocks 60%.
Human life has value, that all human beings have equal value. Your life has value because you are a human being. That's why you have a right to health care. That's why you have a right to housing. That's why you have a right to clean air and clean water. That is the core values shift that will govern whether or not we will face the shocks ahead with humanity or barbarism.
Those people who are suffering that, they're not just the people on CNN running away from the Paradise Fire. They are you, they are your parents, they are your sisters and your brothers, they are your kids. Those are the moments where it happens for them. And once it happens for them, that's empathy, right? Once that empathy comes into the context, into the setting, then this is not a question about abstract ideas. Because again, great policy is about actually situating on people, and great politics is about getting people to see themselves in those people.
The oldest wisdom traditions on this planet are now meshing up kind of perfectly with the newest wisdom traditions on the planet, and both of them at odds with the vision that's governed our civilization for the last 50 or 100 years.
For all those comrades of yours that are now struggling to reclaim our Europe, our cities, our world, our environment. We need Bernie Sanders to run for president.
Jane said, you know what, I wouldn't mind going to Ireland. I said, that's cool, that's cool. So Bernie Sanders, one of the most recognizable names and faces in the world, came to Dublin as Jane's fella. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer, things fall apart, the centre cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed on the world, a blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the procession of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. This discussion here is, I think, about the best people deciding not to lack conviction, but to come to the table and share ideas together. Because if we don't do that, we will lose.
If you had told me 4 years ago that I, a working class woman that didn't have contact with the elites or with any kind of power, would be elected mayor of Barcelona, would be here with Bernie Sanders and all of you, I wouldn't believe it. A new way of doing politics, more inclusive, more democratic, more feminist, more innovative. And we decide to start at local level because the politics of austerity and corruption had destroyed the credibility of public institutions. We needed to provide real and concrete solutions through actions that change people's lives. Because the local level is the best place to improve democracy. It's where we live our daily lives, and it's where the government is closest to the people. So we came together around our shared goals for the city, and without having any media or economical or political power, we won the elections 3 years ago. I was elected a first woman mayor in the history of Barcelona. But you know that winning elections was just the first step, only the first step. What's happened in the last 3 years? Let me start by saying it has not been easy. We are in a minority in government. We've had a complicated situation in Catalonia, as you probably know, and cities in general has limited powers. But despite this, we've changed the agenda. Today, Barcelona is the city with the highest social investment in Spain. For example, we've created a special investment plan for the poorest neighborhoods, or in healthcare, which is not a municipal responsibility. We have created a municipal dentist and a mental health plan. But it's not just about increasing social investment. It's not enough. We are here because we need to make structural changes. Like, for example, creating the first municipal energy company in Spain that provides green energy to city facilities. And for the first time, the city government is standing up to multinationals who speculate in our city. We are forcing big companies to pay their taxes for the first time. We need to build community, locally and internationally. A community that can transform fear into hope. You need action. You need to demonstrate with concrete examples that there's an alternative. No? And in southern Italy, Riace, there's a mayor that opened his little town to immigrants. Salvini is afraid from Mimo Lucano, a little mayor of a little town, because he demonstrates that political of refugees, welcome refugees, is positive for Italy and for Italian people. And now I think it's very important that all of us, we have to say that Mimo Lucano is the mayor of the world. It's our mayor, and we have to defend Mimo Lucano.
We do need a progressive international movement. Young indigenous people live in third world living conditions. I'm also, we live in a country that, despite all of the positives, where my generation is facing a kind of inequality, the likes we haven't seen before, and catastrophic climate change. A generation that is very concerned about violence, women facing misogyny, especially progressive women who speak out, racialized communities. We've had mass shootings, whether it was the mosque in Quebec City or more recently in Toronto. We have a generation that is experiencing a kind of angst we're only beginning to talk about. And for me, perhaps it's no surprise why so many people were inspired by the work of Bernie and the movement that he and you built together, because you spoke to the reality that my generation faces. And that's why I think when we're talking about an international progressive movement, we need three things. We need to be on the ground with people on the front lines, including the so many young people that are leading social movements right now. Indigenous, Black Lives Matter, women's feminist activism, LGBTQ activism. We need to communicate our message. And, and it's been really exciting to meet progressive members of the media here. Because in Canada, let me tell you, it's actually our media concentration is even worse in Canada. And the right wing owns all of it. We need ways of getting our message out. And the third piece is we need, and I would say the most important is we need bold ideas, like the kinds of ideas we've been hearing about all weekend here. That is what mobilizes people in my generation. That is what is mobilizing people here and in my country and around the world. And let's do it. We don't have time to waste. I join many in hoping that the individual sitting next to me will run again for president, because it's clear to me that you, Bernie, you had your finger on the pulse of not just where people in your country are at, but also where people increasingly in my country and around the world are at. We don't actually have Medicare for all. We don't have pharmacare. We don't have dental care. These are the kinds of things that we need to keep pushing for, and what you've done here inspires us to do that. Free tuition, we also don't have that. We have a prime minister who has invested $4.5 billion, our dollars, into buying a pipeline, right? I mean, this is a prime minister and a government that are right hand in hand with big oil. It's a prime minister who's attacking indigenous peoples day in and day out and disrespecting their rights. It's a prime minister who's just brought back to work legislation for postal workers in our country, an anti-worker agenda.
Clear goals, clear plans, and accountability. We ought to be talking with the Chinese about how to build this global grid. So that's a plan. And then is accountability. You know, one thing on any sensible plan, I read hundreds of them year by year, there's no place for the Trans Mountain Pipeline, for example, in any sensible plan in the world. Justin Trudeau should be ashamed of what he's doing. Sustainable development, because it's a good and important concept. It says that we should combine economic prosperity with social justice and with environmental sustainability. This, I think, is the central hard work we have. We have a wealthy world, extraordinarily wealthy world. It's a $130 trillion output this year. It's about $19,000 per person on the planet. But it is socially disastrously unfair, and it is environmentally recklessly unsustainable. Paris Climate Agreement and the other is the Sustainable Development Goals. The Sustainable Development Goals call for the end of poverty by 2030, every child in school, universal health coverage, and decarbonizing the energy system. This is our agenda. It's not being implemented because Bernie isn't president right now. The United Nations in September 2019, every head of state will be there. Well, it'll be about 170 heads of state to report on what will be their non-progress on these ambitions. So the agenda is there. Actually, the specifics are there. We're in the political struggle to turn it into reality. And I think the way to do that, of course, is the politics of this room, the Green New Deal, the propositions that we have heard about social justice, what Yanis is doing throughout Europe to win the European elections next year, but to keep our eye on what it is substantively we need to do and how that can be achieved. That's a matter also of the grunt work of taxes and spending and decarbonization and regulation and getting these things in place. But frankly, we don't have time to lose because we're at the end of this story environmentally, as everybody knows. We basically run out of time. We have no more time for new global agreements. Either we implement what we have said we would do, or we have lost the planet for at least hundreds of millions of people.
Bernie, when you become president,
get progressive ideas out to people. You know, we talk about Trump winning states by 30 points. Understand that in those states, nobody is hearing progressive voices. All they're watching is Fox television or listening to right-wing radio. And we can have all of the brilliant ideas we want here. And one of the reasons that Jane has all these cameras here, by the way, not, you know, just 1,000 people. It's a small group of people. The goal here is to use social media. It's not good enough to talk to each other. Get that word out to people who have not heard these ideas. Trump became president of the United States because there is a massive amount of pain in this country, which is not seen on television, which many of my Democratic colleagues do not know and do not talk about. The life expectancy in the United States of America has declined for the third straight year. And often that is taking place in rural areas where people have no income, no jobs, no education, no hope for their kids. So we have got to reach out to all of our brothers and sisters. When people are pushed aside economically in rural areas, when people are hurting, you have demagogues who deal with that pain and say the problem is that Mexican immigrant who's picking strawberries for $8 an hour, or that person from Syria who has come in to the UK, all right? So you take that anger and frustration and hurt that people are feeling and you turn them against people who are in worse shape than you are, all right? And our job is to bring our people together to say, no, it is not some Mexican picking strawberries for $8 an hour who's our enemy. It is Wall Street. It is the fossil fuel industry. It is the drug companies. It's the insurance companies. Let's stand together and take those people. The top 1% in this globe owning more wealth than the bottom 90%. That's just not wealth, that's power. And when Nikki talks about the media, those are the people who not only own the media in Canada, it's Rupert Murdoch, it's Fox, it's right-wing folks who control the level of discussion in this country and all over the world. It is the fossil fuel industry who worries more about their short-term profits than they worry about the future of this planet. It is the prison industrial complex. It is the military industrial complex. We heard in the last panel the enormous amount of money being spent on prisons and police. Forget that. We are spending $700 $100 billion on the military in the United States alone. That is more than the next 10 nations, most of whom are our allies. Throughout the world, we're spending well over $1 trillion on the military. Think what that could do to alleviate poverty in this world, to provide the quality of education. So in fact, to do what all of us know we can do, and that is that we have the technology now to transform our energy system away from fossil fuel. And by the way, when we do that, we create millions of good jobs in this country and around the world. We have to stand up and fight on, which too few of us are now doing. And that is the greed and recklessness of Wall Street. All right? You're not going to see too much of that on CBS. But you got a half a dozen, Jeff, correct me if I'm wrong, a half a dozen major financial institutions that have assets of what, 60% of the GDP of America. These people have incredible power. They run Greece. They run countries all over the world.
60% of children in Greece are below the poverty line, the 2008 poverty line. 1 in 2 families have no one working in it. Now, what happened then? Such a Great Depression, friends, begets a progressive movement that responds, and Nazis. We have the 3rd largest party in our parliament is not a neo-Nazi party. There's nothing neo about them. They do Sieg Heils, they have Hitler. A certain senator from Vermont wrote a brilliant letter, you remember that, Bert, to the managing director of the International Monetary Fund, Christine Lagarde, and shared a piece of his mind with her regarding the crime against logic, not just humanity, that the IMF and other institutions, creditor institutions, were. Effectively, we are the Puerto Rico of Europe. And it's not my saying, this was what the finance minister of Germany said to your own finance minister, Jacques Leu, when Jacques Leu just very mildly complained about the treatment of Greece by Germany, the German government, but not by Germany, and Wolfgang Schäuble said, would you trade Puerto Rico for Greece? This is the kind of mindset which typifies the collapse. Now, during that month as well, a certain professor of economics from this country, actually a couple of them, and both of them are in the room, one is Jeff Sachs, the other is Jamie Galbraith, joined my team, and we did battle together. The reason why I'm saying that is because interconnectedness, as Bernie was saying, is at the heart both of the Nazi movement and the establishment, the 2 faces of authoritarianism. Because Mr. Valls, who's going to be competing against ABBA, is one of the faces of authoritarianism. Macron, Merkel are the same face. The ones who said to me when I moved into the corridors of power, very, very fleetingly, they said to me, elections cannot be allowed to change economic policy. To which I responded, this is a great piece of news for the Chinese Communist Party because they believe the same. And the other face of the same monster of authoritarianism, of course, is the Nazis that are growing up everywhere. The Trumps. Mr. Bannon understands internationalism. He is going up and down Europe, trying to organize the Salvinis, the Kurzis, the Seehofers against civilization, effectively. We have to respond with a progressive international. In the previous sections, we were talking about the Green New Deal. If we do not succeed in the international Green New Deal, not an American one, not a North American one, not a white one, not a European Atlanticist Green New Deal, but an international New Deal, ruin without end is going to loom black across our lands, our rivers, our mountains. Colleagues, friends, comrades, ladies and gentlemen, it's not enough for us to get together and chat once every 6 months, every 12 months. Because the bad people that David McWilliams was referring to do a lot more than that. They work in real time, in continuous time, every day. And we need to create a progressive international that does work constantly to create a plan, a blueprint, in order to empower the dream. We are now going to issue an open call to all progressives in the world. Because what happens as of tomorrow is going to make any difference in this fight against the two faces of authoritarianism, against the Salvinis of the world on the one hand, and the so-called liberal establishment that created the crisis that begat the Salvinis of the world. Our Progressive International will reach out to communities in every corner of the world to help build our shared vision. Our Progressive International will stand by people who are already fighting to end inequality, exploitation, discrimination, and environmental degradation. Our Progressive International will reclaim our communities, our cities, our countries, and our planet with a bold international New Deal, Green New Deal, that we will work together to deliver. It is time for progressives of the world to unite. Today, on behalf of DiEM25 and the Sanders Institute, we issue a call to action to create a global network of individuals and organizations that will fight together for dignity, peace, prosperity, and the future of our planet. Join us.
I served as a member of a progressive government after the banking collapse in Iceland 28. We managed actually to counterbalance austerity with redistribution designed to protect our social welfare system. This shows that it is possible to resist antisocial ideologies designed by neoliberal ideologies. Therefore, I want to give my voice to Progressive International, which is strongly committed to transformative politics, sustainability, economic and social rights, and dignity for all people.
There is a global struggle taking place of enormous consequence. Nothing less than the future of humanity is at stake. All around us, we see the status quo is failing. The top 1% now controls half the world's wealth, while hundreds of millions of workers remain trapped between poverty and precarity. Where globalization promised prosperity, it's delivered financial crisis and endless war instead. All the while, our climate moves closer to destruction. Out of this crisis, global authoritarianism is rising. These leaders promise to restore national pride by attacking minorities, a free press, and democracy itself. But in the end, they only serve themselves. A chilling echo of the 1930s. Today's authoritarian leaders do not stand alone. They are part of a global axis of right-wing parties that shares funders, strategy, and contacts. And around the world, they are gaining power. The time has come to form our own common front in the fight for global peace and prosperity. This movement will bring people together across the global left to think about the world we want to live in and how we make it a reality. A grassroots movement mobilizing working people all around the world behind a shared vision of democracy, sustainability, and solidarity. We will no longer settle for reformism. We will reach out to communities in every corner of the world and build shared power and solidarity. In every country, there are people who are fighting for progress, and we are so much stronger together. It is time for progressives of the world to unite. Let us begin today, building a better tomorrow.